In this video, we're going to continue to explore functions by talking about how we can create functions with multiple arguments and how we can set default values for arguments that aren't actually provided when the function is called. To do this, we're going to create a brand new file in the functions directory. Let's go ahead and call this one something like arguments.js. And then we're going to go ahead and mess around with 3 examples. The first 2 exploring the features, and the last one a challenge for you. We're going to kick things off by creating a function that takes multiple arguments. It is going to take in multiple numbers, add them all together, and return the sum. So if we were going to set that up, we could use let to create add and set it equal to right here. What are we going to set it equal to? A function. And that function is going to take multiple arguments, but for the moment, we'll just put nothing inside of parentheses. Now, if we were to call add and do something with the result, it might look a bit like this. Let result equal a call to add, and then we can do something with the result, like print it, console.log result. Now, this is just a little template for how things might look, but it doesn't actually return anything, so result is going to print undefined, which is what we learned about in the last video. Now let's actually set up the arguments and function body for add. If we wanted a single argument for add, what would we do? We would just name it right here. If I was going to call it a, for example, I would set up a, and then I could use a down below, assuming it was actually passed in. So for example, I could pass in the value 10. Now, if I want to pass in multiple arguments, how do I set up the definition right here? All I do is I separate their names by a comma. So comma, and people usually add a space for formatting purposes, and then right here, I can pick what I want to call the second argument that's provided. So for example, I could call it b, and then I could pass in a second value by separating it by a comma. So right here, 10 for the first value, and let's use 1 for the second. So with this call signature, we're going to have a equal 10 and b equal 1. So if I were to add them up and return the value, I would expect 11 to come back. Now we could go ahead and create a variable where we add the 2 numbers together and then return that variable. But you can actually just provide the expression right in line. So I can return a plus b. This is going to add a and b together, resulting in 11. It's then going to return it, and if we run our script, we should actually see the sum printing. Let's go ahead and save the file and check out what happens. Over here in the terminal, I'm going to run it node arguments.js. When I do, I see 11 printing, which is exactly what we were hoping for. So if we want to provide multiple arguments, we just create a comma-separated list, both in the function definition and in the call signature, where we actually pass values in to the function. Now we could go further. There's no reason to stop at 2. You can have as many arguments as your function needs. So let's say we needed a third one, comma, with a C afterwards, and then we could provide a third value. For example, I could provide 5. Now I would expect the sum to be 16, assuming I actually use C right here. So A plus B plus C, the result should be 16, and if I rerun the script using the up arrow and enter, that is exactly what we get. Now, there's really not a whole lot to it. You can add as many arguments as you want. You can have a function with no arguments, and there's no rule for when to use which. It's really going to depend on what the function needs. So if we're creating a function that calculates your income tax, we're going to need certain values. We might need 1 argument, for example, the amount of income you actually made. Other functions will need more arguments. Other functions will need less. So we've explored how we can set up multiple arguments. Now what I want to do is figure out how we can provide a default value if an argument isn't actually provided when the function is called. Let's go ahead and explore this with a second example down below. Right here, default arguments, and up above at the very top of the file, I'm just going to leave a little comment about this example. Here we explored multiple arguments. Awesome. So how do we use default arguments? Let's explore with an example. Let's imagine we're creating a multiplayer video game and there's a leaderboard, right? So all of the players ranked from the people with the most points to the least. Now there's 2 pieces of information that we're going to need in order to generate the individual row. We're going to need the user's name and their score. Now, not everyone's going to have a score. If you haven't played a game yet, we're going to come up with a good default value. We'll use 0. And not everyone is going to provide a name. Maybe you want to remain anonymous, so we're going to come up with a default name as well. Let's explore what this might look like. We're still going to be making a function. I'm going to call this one get score text. So this would just be one part of our video game. And I'm going to set it equal to a function. And this function is going to take 2 arguments, the name of the player and the player's score. Then, down below in the function body, we're going to go ahead and actually use these 2 values to generate a string. Before we do though, let's just use console.log to print out name. Then on the next line, console.log to print out score. And what we're going to do is call the function down below. I'm going to call get score text, and I'm going to provide no values. So I'm going to call it just like this. Based off of what we learned in the last video, I know that name and score will both be undefined. And if I rerun the file, I would expect to see undefined twice. I'm going to rerun things over inside of the terminal, and what do I get? I get 16 from the first example and undefined twice from the second example. So by default, if we do not provide an argument value, nothing is going to show up. But we can actually set up defaults, and we do that right here in our function definition. So when I define that the second argument should be called score, I can also provide a default value for that. So if it isn't provided, use this. In this case, we can set it equal to the number 0. How do we do that? Well, after the argument name, we use space equals space, and we give it a value. So the value could be a string, a Boolean, anything in JavaScript. In our case, it makes sense to use a number since we're talking about a score. So I'm going to type 0 right in here. Now we could say that score has a default value. If we change nothing about our function call and rerun the program, we're no longer going to see undefined. We're actually going to see 0. So what happens here? The function executes. It says, all right, call that second one score. There is no value, so use the default, and that is what prints. Now, should we provide a value in the call, it would be used. So for example, if I set the name equal to Andrew as the first argument and the score equal to 100, 100 is going to get used instead of 0. This value only gets used if there is no provided argument value. So in this case, I would expect to see Andrew and 100. And that's exactly what I get. We overrode the default value because we actually provided one. Now we could do the same thing for the first argument as well. I could set a default value for this. So after the argument name, space equals space. And in this case, we're going to provide a string value as the default value. So I can open and close some strings using single quotes, and right inside I can provide that value. And I'm going to call players with no name anonymous. Excellent. Now we have default values for both, and this makes the function a little more robust. We could provide no values, we could provide all of them, or we could provide some combination in between. So let's go ahead and delete all of the values we pass into the function and just make sure our other default is working. Right here, I rerun things, I get anonymous, and I get 0. With the defaults in place, we can actually work on making our function do something meaningful with these 2 pieces of information. So in the end of the day, get score text is going to return the score text, and I'm going to assign it to a variable. Let score text equal whatever comes back from calling get score text, then I'll print it console.log score text. Now all we need to do is to actually return a string from this function as opposed to just seeing what the argument values are. So I'm going to delete those console.log calls. Right here, we can return a new string. So for this one, this is going to be the individual line in our leaderboard. I'll start off with name, :space, and then I'm going to concatenate on the name, whether it's the default value anonymous or a value actually provided when the function was called. Right here, though, either way, we get access to that via name. So that's the first part. And the second part, I'm going to concatenate on a space, then score : space, and then their score. So right here, plus score. Now we're going to get a useful string back, and when we call the function and print it, we should see our little string with the values provided. In this case, default values for both, since none are passed in to the function call. I'm going to rerun things from the terminal. And right here, we get just that. Name anonymous, score 0. We could actually put another little hyphen maybe right in between to make things a little easier to read. Awesome. Now let's go ahead and provide values. So I am going to provide a name, Andrew, and we'll say that I haven't played a game yet. So I'll leave score out of the function call. That means the default value is going to be used. And if I save the file and rerun it, I get name, Andrew, and I get score 0. We could also do the opposite. I could say there is no name, but they do have a score. Now, if I want to provide the second argument, but I don't want to provide the first, what I have to do is use undefined right here. So undefined, comma, followed by that second value. Let's go ahead and say I have a score of 99. Now I would get name anonymous and score 99. So we can provide no value for other arguments. We just use undefined right there. And remember, the only reason I'm doing this is because I want to get access to the second argument and actually assign a value. So I do have to provide something for the first one. If I left things like this, whoops, like this, what would happen? I would have 99 for the name. By providing undefined, I make sure that 99 gets set as the score. Perfect. Now it's challenge time. Down below, let's create a little challenge area. And what you're going to do is create a new function that has multiple arguments and uses the default arguments we just explored. This little function is going to be a tip calculator. So you could call the function something like getTip. Let's imagine that we go to a restaurant and we spend $100 and we want to tip 20%. What is that number? That would be a $20 tip. We're going to create a little function that figures that out for you. So right here, the function is going to take two arguments. It is going to take the total for the bill, and it's going to take the percentage you want to tip. You could call this like tip percent, for example. Now for the total, it doesn't really make sense to have a default. Each bill is going to be different depending on what you ordered, but for the tip, we could go ahead and come up with a default tip percentage. We could say 20%, for example, and we're going to reflect this as a decimal point. So 0.5 would be a 50% tip, 0.1 would be a 10% tip, or 0.2 for a 20% tip. We take the total, 100, we multiply it by 0.2, that is going to result in 20, which is the correct tip value. All you're going to do is run that calculation, return the value, and that's going to be it for the function. So two arguments, a default for one of them. Then I want you to go ahead and actually use it. Call the function a couple of times with different values for the total and the tip. Make sure that the default tip percent shows up, and make sure that if you provide a different one like 0.3, that actually gets used. Take as much time as you need to create this function and mess around with it. If you get stuck, try to work through your problem, and then we're going to come back and go through things together. Pause the video, and when you're done, click play. All right, how'd that one go? I'm going to kick things off by creating my function, and I'm going to do that right here. Let getTip equal a function. This function is going to have two arguments. We'll provide those in just a second. Right here, the first one is going to be the total for the bill. Once again, no default for this one. Each one is going to be different. The second one is going to be the tip percent. And it's okay if you called these things something else. That's not the important part. The important part is the actual function setup itself. Now for the tip percent, we are going to come up with a default value. I'm going to set it equal to 0.2. So by default, you can just provide the total and we will calculate the tip based off of that 20% number. Inside of here, what do we need to do? We just need to multiply the two values together and return the result. So I can return total times tip percent. Perfect. Now down below, we can actually use that function. So right here, I am going to let tip equal, and then I'm going to call getTip. And I'm going to pass in a total. Let's say 100 using that example I came up with before. And for this one, I'm not going to provide a tip percent value. So it should use the default 0.2. Right here, console.log tip. I'm going to remove the comment and then I'm going to actually run the file. Let's save things and execute them. I'm going to use clear to clear the terminal output and the up arrow key twice to rerun the arguments file. Right here, what do I get for the tip? I get 20, which is indeed correct. Now let's override that and provide a different tip percent. I'm going to provide 0.25, a 25% tip. And now if I rerun things, what do I get? Right here, I get $25. And if I were to change the input value, setting it to something like 40, I would get 25% of 40, which would be $10. And if I rerun it, that's exactly what we get. So real-world functions aren't just going to have a single argument like we saw in the past. Real-world functions are going to take multiple arguments. There are certain values like total that we're going to require. There are others like tip percent where it does make sense to have a default value. And you're going to get a lot of experience with this as we actually use functions in the projects we create. Now that we know this, though, we are ready to continue learning about functions, and we're going to do just that in the next video. Stay tuned. I'll see you then.